So I'm going to be talking to you about harmonious bilingualism in bilingual families. Where does it start? Well, usually with this, love. Love, right. Love creates families, a lot of them, all over. Diverse families, different people from all over the world. In fact, you know, in the European Union, European Union, last year I think it was, they proudly announced that they think that the Erasmus program, so that's the student exchange program amongst European countries, that there are at least 1 million Erasmus babies. So there you go, you know. It's just a very diverse world. We know about that. So there is an increasing number of young families that find themselves in bilingual and multilingual settings. I mean, increased, we have that impression. Of course, we really don't know because we don't really have historical data that would really tell us, but everybody, there are few people who say that that's not true. So let's go with it. It's true. Yes. But there's also a lot of them who don't have much personal experience with multilingualism. They are a person who's been raised monolingually and then learned foreign languages at school, who meets up an equally monolingually raised person who learned foreign languages at school, and they often talk English to each other, which is neither of their first language, and then they get married and they have kids. And then the issue is like, yeah, what to speak to the children, right? And people just don't know. They don't have that experience within their own life. And they wonder how they should raise children bilingually, whether they should do so, or multilingually. And I'm here, actually, when I say bilingual, I really mean that to include multilingual. That's not really limited for me to 2 languages. And also it's not limited to me to 2 named languages. It could be different dialects, you know, strongly different varieties as well. But, you know, we can maybe talk about that in the question time if you want to. Many people worry about whether early bilingualism will be a positive or a negative experience for their children. So, indeed, it is true, you know, and I've color-coded. You know, when I say something in red letters, it means it's not so good. When it's green letters, it means, hey, it's better. That's my evaluation. Yeah. So, but early bilingualism can actually be a negative or a less than positive experience for children and their families. And when I first started out, Lourdes mentioned my book from 1990, well, where I had done research on children. Well, basically that's one case study, but I had collected data on many more children, and in fact, Dutch-English bilingual children. In fact, for 2 or 3 of those children that I recorded, well, basically I stopped recording because they spoke only one language. But I didn't go into people's feelings about it then. I was just a young PhD student, you know, you don't learn everything at once. Okay. Right. But anyway, very soon, after I finished my PhD or in the course of it, I did realize this, but I wasn't paying much attention to it then. So I think that this is what people want, namely harmonious bilingualism. And I introduced the term harmonious bilingual development, which is more specific in various publications, which maybe you've heard about. So also just now recently, I've really focused on harmonious bilingualism, so well-being for families in bilingual settings, in this book that's just come out, I think, Handbook of Social and Affective Factors in Home Language Maintenance and Development. And there's a lot more interest coming up in those social and affective factors, a lot more. So when I started out as a PhD student, nobody was talking about that. No. Doesn't mean that not occasionally did you find here and there a comment about it, but nobody was really focusing on it. Okay, and here, as I said, I have written in German. This is my first one. Well, just that's basically about what happens when children who are raised bilingually when they come into preschool. Okay. So, harmonious bilingualism, exactly. What is that? It refers to a sense of subjective well-being and satisfaction that young families, so that includes the parents and the children, really, that they experience in a language contact situation. So a language contact situation, that's any situation where it's obvious that there's language variation, and it's obvious and it's felt and realized by the people who are in the situation. And this would be in the absence of negative experiences, which are attributed to this linguistically diverse situation. So it can be a sense of subjective well-being, or just, also it's just normal, so I'm fine with it, or I'm not even thinking about it. I'm not attributing problems in my life to the fact that I am being raised bilingually, or that my family is a bilingual family, and so on. So, of course, having this sense of subjective well-being in a bilingual setting is a very intensely personal experience. How can I say, how your feeling of well-being is, or your feeling of well-being? It's you decide, basically. It's not for me, the researcher, to decide how you're going to feel. Yet, I think we can make already at this point in time, based on various studies that have been carried out, and just also on experience with families, there do appear to be two main hallmarks of harmonious bilingualism. Namely, harmonious bilingualism is only really possible if there is a general acceptance of the fact that children are growing up with two languages. So, if your pediatrician says, no, speaking two languages is bad for your child, you got to speak just one, you're not going to have harmonious bilingualism, because what are you going to do as a parent? You're going to go against the advice of the pediatrician, and you're a first parent, and you don't know, you want to do what's best, and they know best about kids, right? So this is very basic. There are often these negative attitudes towards early child bilingualism, or a particular home language. In my own case, when I took my child to school, we used to live in the United States, and then we moved to Belgium, and then I put her into a school, a Dutch-speaking school in Flanders, and I then said, oh, well, my child is bilingual, and they said, oh, no, that's not good, no, that's going to really confuse her. And I said, well, she speaks English very well, and Dutch too. Oh, English, oh, that's fine. It's the French they were thinking of. No good, because they don't like French in Flanders. It's as simple as that. Parents themselves may hold negative attitudes. Relatives may hold negative attitudes. The influence of grandma, mostly, is very strong. Grandma disapproves. It's very difficult to go against that. As I mentioned, pediatricians may hold negative attitudes or may just not know. We should all realize that pediatricians are not trained in early child bilingualism. So let's not take them too seriously about that. Child care workers may hold negative attitudes. Unfortunately, they also are not really trained. Teachers, the same thing, although some things are moving in those two areas with child care workers and teachers. Family friends may hold negative attitudes, and there may be a generally negative attitude towards early bilingualism in the society at large. So this is really very difficult to combat as a young parent who's just given birth. You've just got your new baby. Also for the fathers, it's the same problem, although Who can stand up to all of that? So that was one aspect of it. Then the next aspect is that children who regularly hear two languages, that they also actually speak them. That is really important for harmonious bilingualism to be in place. For, let me put this way, for people to feel no particularly bad feelings about the languages that they're having in their situation. And Lourdes referred to my study in Flanders with the help of many students, yes, but we managed. That we found out that a quarter of children who hear a home language that is not the school language, they don't speak that particular home language. And so in this particular study, I'm here focusing just on the 2,250 families of the over 18,000 families that we surveyed, where in those 2,250 families, there was at least one parent who at home spoke a language other than the school language. In addition, that parent might have spoken the school language as well. And there were 5,320 children in those families, and of those 5,320, a full quarter did not speak two languages, but only one. And since then, just finished writing an overview chapter that also surveys other surveys that suggest the same proportion, more or less. It's between maybe 20% and 25%. In other places in the world, we get those same numbers. Even in the north of Australia, where children are learning or hearing Aboriginal languages and English, there's even a study showing, that a quarter of those children do not speak an Aboriginal language. So the same percentage. Plus there's a study from Miami, you find the same percentage. So this is it happens a lot, and it's not specific to Europe. Now there are several possible reasons for why children do not speak a language that they hear at home. Well, maybe they don't hear that language frequently enough. That happens, that happens quite a bit. So if there's one parent who speaks that language to the child and nobody else, and that one parent doesn't spend a lot of time with the child, there's just not enough not enough language going around, because we do know that monolingual children, that they really learn from the environment, and that it matters. And the number of words that children learn depends on the number of words that they hear. Quite a simple relationship. Many linguists don't want to really accept this because it's too simple. But it's very important for these little children. We're talking about very little children. We don't know to what extent this effect continues over time, but for the very, very young ones, it's very important. So how often? Then the quality of what's called child-directed speech, so how people speak to children. The quality, what do I mean by that? Well, if I speak to a one-year-old, if I speak to them the way that I'm speaking to you now, that one-year-old is just not going to have any intake of this language use. Or if to a young baby, that's how it already starts, when a child is 2 months of age. I really do need to speak to a baby very differently than from how I speak to you. Yes, oh, you can smile. Oh, isn't that fun? Yeah, fun. And with the mimicry and everything, I need to help the child get an entrance into the language. And that's what I do when I'm using this infant-directed speech, this very particular way of talking to a young child. That's how I can help the child. And not all parents do this. Not even all mothers do this. And there are all cultural differences, but not only just cultural, also just individual differences in the extent to which people do this. Or also, and Pat Cool in Washington State has shown this to be the case, that infants at age 6 months, well, there's a huge difference, individual difference amongst them, just monolinguals, in how well they are able to perceive distinctions between particular vowel sounds and consonantal sounds. And she has traced this back to how clearly the mothers were enunciating. So if you mumble, your kid is going to have a problem figuring out what it is you're saying. Very basic. But that's what I mean by the quality of child-directed speech. I'm not even here referring, although that is also important probably, speaking with an accent and all that. Well, perhaps it has an effect, but we really don't know much about that yet. But it's mostly about, am I using speech that is really generally known to be supportive of young children's language development? Then, this is a very important one, the communicative need for active use of each language. I'm working on a chapter right about that because very little attention has been paid to that. It's like, how do I do in discourse? Liz Lanza, her work already, also her book from 1997, but her first article about it from 92, mentioned the importance of discourse strategies, of using in a conversation with a young, bilingually raised child, whether you allow them to use two languages with you in a conversation or not. So you socialize them into using a particular language or not. Like we socialize children into using polite language, into saying like, please, if they say cookie. I think many people would say, cookie, please. No. And then if they say, please, cookie, or peas, cookie, then they get their cookie, but they have to say peas, right? So it's like that you can do this, socialize children, but maybe not in that same way, in that same explicit way, but you can say, like, if your child is speaking to you in a language that at that moment you're not using with them, you can say, what? And maybe, well, Liz calls it feigning to be a monolingual, but I think in many cases, judging also from my own experience, it's not feigning. It's just you're in a particular language mode. I don't know if you've heard of Grosjean and his language modes. You're in a particular language mode as an adult. You can be in a bilingual language mode and be open to just anything that's being said and understand it. Or you can be in a more monolingual mode. I have a little bit of evidence about that from my own just private recordings of conversations with my daughter. I never did study her, but just where I'm hearing on the tape, you know, I used to only speak Dutch with her when she was 2 years of age, and she was able to speak both Dutch and English. And I heard on the tape that she said something to me in English. Now, I understand English, but at that time, I really didn't. I said, what? You know, I had not understood her because I wasn't expecting her to speak English to me. So, and I said, what? And she changed to saying it in Dutch, sorry. So I used a monolingual discourse strategy, as Ms. Lanzas has called it, rather than a bilingual one where I'm not paying attention to what language she's using. And so we need more information on the effect of this on children, but that's what I mean by a communicative need for active use of each language. If a child doesn't need to speak a particular language, they won't. It's very simple. Yeah. But a lot of parents are not aware of that. And a lot of researchers are sadly not aware of that either. And it takes a lot of effort to carry out studies like that, but there's one fantastic study more in an experimental vein by Park et al. 2012, where they actually had parents, I think there were like over 50 families that they engaged with Chinese English, where they had parents actually talk to children and they recorded it, and they actually categorized how parents were doing this, and then there was a time too later on. And lo and behold, the parents who were kind of allowing English or Chinese, well, 6 months later, their children were speaking even less Chinese because it was here in the United States than before. And those who had not allowed that earlier, well, those kids were speaking much better Chinese. So that's like the only study so far that really has shown some real proof there that it's really important. But the bulk of the studies now, as we have them, the case studies, shows that this is really important, communicative need. And then there's actually the opportunities for children to actually speak each language. And it's here, practice makes perfect, and that actually is also a phrase used by Eve Clark, who's a specialist on monolingual child language acquisition, English. And she says that also, that just in one language, it's very important for a child to practice a particular language. And so children would need to be able to do that with people in both languages. And that's often, well, maybe not the case that there's, you know, maybe there's a lot more opportunities for the one language in comparison to the other, for instance. And then there's also community expectations and attitudes, including children's own attitudes. If you can see it, yeah, it's at the bottom, sorry. So, and I'll talk about that a little later. There's also identity issues, and there's a whole lot more that we probably don't know about yet. So there are many possible reasons. But what happens if children only speak a single language in spite of parental input in the other one? What happens then? Well, it may become impossible for these children to communicate with members of their extended family and their family friends. And that can be, you know, even with grandma who lives in Russia. And, you know, Skype with grandma in Russia no longer possible because the child who lives here in the United States no longer speaks any Russian. Maybe they did when they were very young, but starting when they're age 4, when they start to go to preschool, the Russians just evaporated. So there's no relationship possible between the child and the relative, the important relatives also. And that's very sad, especially for the relatives, but also for the children. And then also, we know that communication between parents and children may be adversely affected. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Because both parents and children, and we know that from mostly research in the United States with adolescents and children, adolescents and their parents, I mean, that both parties may feel a sense of loss of identity, loss of culture, loss of emotional bonding. There are many studies actually that show this, and that it has to do with parents and children using the same language, speaking the same language to each other, but the same non-school language to each other in proficient ways, proficiently, at equal levels of proficiency also. So that is very, very important. Yeah, I want to just add to this that lots of parents also feel adolescence is tough anyway. You know, for the parents here, we know that all of us have been adolescents, and you know, I think back and I think, oh, I'm pretty ashamed how I treated my parents as an adolescent. You know, it's difficult for both parties. So if, in addition to that, you don't speak the same language to each other, it really creates this chasm. There is much less bonding going on, and parents claim that they have very little authority over their children if they cannot speak the same language, or they do not speak the same language as their children. I mean, conversation is still possible, so the child will speak the school language and the parent will respond in the other language because it's their language and because maybe they're not so proficient in the school language, right? So it's not a good idea. And that is because language as a means of communication is highly, highly symbolic, and it relates to cultural and personal identity. And the languages, and now I'm shifting from just the home to outside the home, and the languages that children bring to school from home are usually not used there and are often entirely ignored. And this implicitly shows children, and they are already very sensitive to this when they're 4 years of age, shows that these languages are attributed less value than the school language, or the school languages. And so a large part of children's cultural identities is thus ignored and not valued. And it appears as if part of them does not exist. So children also feel that they themselves are worth less. When you ignore my language, you're ignoring me as a person. When you reject my language, it's even worse. You are rejecting me as a person. And I just had, last year, I spoke in Germany, and I've spoken about this particular topic a lot, especially in Germany, to actually people who work in childcare centers. And there was a workshop also where there were a lot of highly experienced and older childcare workers. And there was one story there, because they all have experience with multilingual children in groups. There was one childcare worker who spoke Arabic, who was a German person, but who spoke Arabic. Well, of course, there's lots of German persons who speak Arabic. What I meant is she was not of Arabic heritage at all. But she was like a person, they have that too, who went and helped out at various childcare centers. There are various systems that exist there. And she came to a childcare center where a child who had been there for half a year, 7 months, and who hadn't, who was very withdrawn. And she asked a little bit about the child's home environment, and was told that at home they speak Arabic. So she talked to this kid in Arabic. This kid, big smile, and after 2 days he was speaking German. And he's engaging in the classroom. That's just the power of the symbol, of the symbolism of language. And so ignoring and or disrespecting, even worse, other languages than the school language at school is not a good foundation for the fostering of children's well-being, and it hinders children's social integration. I have here another sad example from British research about a child called Smita. And Smita, she lives in the United Kingdom, and at home she hears Bengali and hardly any English. And unlike the 4 kids in my little book there, this is a case study of this particular child, a real child, yes. And at age 3, Smita speaks Bengali fluently, and she's a happy child who gets along with everybody pretty much. And at age 3.5, Smita starts attending preschool. And there everybody only speaks English. And nobody understands Bengali. And Smita understands nobody there. So she cries every day. At home she seems to be depressed. Smita's parents would like for her to continue going to this preschool because they want her to learn English. They themselves don't really speak any English. And Smita says nothing at school. And there she feels excluded, not understood, and depressed. I don't think we need a really, we could ask her maybe, but it's very clear. There's a lack of well-being in this child. But just imagine, when you are a 2.5-year-old, at age 2.5, you're just starting to discover the power of language. You no longer have to scream to get what you want. You can talk about it. You can point to things and name them. And you can also, when you're 3, well, you can build sentences, and you can actually argue through language. There are various examples on YouTube, wonderful examples of 3-year-olds having fantastic verbal arguments with their parents, trying to convince their parents for this and that. They have, and that's how they express who they are, because they want something, and they know that through talking, they might change your mind and get what they want. Yes. And that's the experience children have of becoming a person and being able to express themselves through language. Then boom, in this case, like Smita, says, up. She's just gotten this idea of, yeah, I can talk, you know. Yeah, I'm doing fine. And then boom, dropped in this situation where this language thing, it doesn't work anymore. It must be so shocking. It must be so shocking. When we, as adults, go to a country where we don't speak the language, Hungarian for instance, I think most of us here don't know Hungarian. Well, we know we're not going to be able to understand what they're doing there, and we're going to try and strategize about how we're going to deal with that, yeah? But not a 3.5-year-old can't do that. So this is like a horrible, horrible experience for a 3.5-year-old. Yeah. Now, at age 4.5, that's a year later. A year later, that's like a quarter of the child's life, more or less. She still isn't speaking at school. At home, she's somewhat happier again, and she makes great strides in her Bengali language development. But she still hates going to school. She tells her parents that she understands nothing of what goes on. What the teacher says, she just checks on what the others, she just looks, sees what the others are doing, and then she does the same, otherwise the teacher is angry. She has no friends at school, because there are no other Bengali-speaking children there. And when she is 5 years of age, the teacher expresses her concern about Smita. She doubts that Smita will be able to go to primary school, because after all, Smita doesn't speak. And she's forgetting entirely that this child speaks fluent Bengali. Yeah? It's only the English that matters in the United Kingdom, in most places. Yeah, so that was one example. And by the way, I should mention that in a lot of the literature, and I must confess that I myself also, well, accepted that there is a silent period. This is called the silent period, this Smita. That's kind of the normal part of early second language acquisition for children who go to school, who start attending a preschool in a language that they don't have at home. I thought, oh, that's kind of, it's portrayed as being normal. Well, that started to, well, it's not normal. There is a lot of variation amongst children in how long they have some kind of silent period in which they do not speak, but there's a lot of children who do, and it will probably depend on how preschool teachers handle, you know, the fact that the child speaks another language. So maybe, you know, but we can talk about that some later. Anyway, it's not, I don't think it's a normal or accepted, it's a horrible state of development. So let's not assume that it's normal. Okay, so here's an example from an Algerian woman who went to France eventually and wrote this because she became a psychiatrist, a child psychiatrist in France. But she reports on herself when she was young, and in the book, it's a fantastic book which I only discovered, well, too late, I guess. She also discusses children then in France with similar experiences. So her name is Zerdalia, and at age 3, she lived in Algeria when she was a little kid, and she attended a French-speaking school in Algiers at that time, during the colonial time still, when France was still, when Algiers was still a French colony. And she spoke Arabic at home. And on her first day at preschool, she was also only 3, she was shocked to hear her teacher mispronounce her name, and at the fact that she could not understand anything, like Smita. After a year of listening silently, also, you know, that's a year, so it's a long time for a small child to not say anything, at school, and trying to decipher what was going on, so Daria noticed that some children received candy after they said something. She also wanted candy. And so she thought she'd figured out something to say that the teacher would like. So excitedly she got up and she said something, but she only got a cold stare back. pointing at her seat, no candy. But she was really lucky. But here, it's a linguistically determined lack of well-being. But I'm just going to say that in her second year of preschool, she had a new teacher came from France who wanted to learn Arabic. Yeah, which was made very difficult and who came to Zerdalia's home, and Zerdalia's parents thought this was ridiculous, that the teacher came to their home, and they laughed at her for wanting to learn Arabic, but, you know, Zerdalia just fell in love with the teacher as little children do, and life changed for her. But anyway, before that wonderful teacher, new young teacher from France, from children like Smita and Zerdalia, their lack of well-being is related to not enough understanding, that's for sure, and hence not being able to take part in class activities and learning. You can only learn if you can understand what's going on. But also, it has to do with not being understood yourself, and thus not really being recognized as a person, and feeling excluded. So, linguistically determined lack of well-being at preschool occurs when, again, children don't understand the school language, children are unable to use the language or the languages they already know to make themselves understood. Children experience an explicit rejection of a language they bring to the classroom from home, usually by the teacher, often also by the other children. Children experience that a language they bring to class from home is worth less than the school language. And also when children who try to speak the school language are implicitly rejected in their attempts to do so, and they're not being supported. As a solution, many children, so here comes the link with the big data from the survey. As a solution, many children will reject one of their home languages and will refuse to speak it. Because this happens to children also who have two languages at home, one of which is the school language. They will still feel that their other language, which is totally ignored at school, well, that means it's not worth much, right? So through doing so, you know, rejecting one of their home languages, they hope that they will be more valued at school or preschool. Language refusal, however, as I already indicated, has a very negative effect on communication within the family, and it usually does not contribute to positive feelings in the family, because parents of 4-year-olds often feel rejected by their children because their language is being rejected. So here we are, full circle. I have, you know, I did write a chapter about that a few years back, pulling together data from European studies that spoke to this issue of how parents of preschool children, so parents of children under the age of 6, felt about their children not speaking their language. This was also inspired somewhat by a conversation I'd had with a very fancy woman at a fancy place in Austria somewhere, a woman I did not know, and a woman probably my age, who, you know, people ask me, what do you do? And then I say, well, you know, I study how children become bilingual, how they learn several languages. And this woman immediately, I've never met this person. This woman, her tears spring in her eyes. And she said, oh, it didn't work for me. I said, oh? Yeah, she said, now my children, yeah, now they speak some German. But, you know, we lived in the United States, and I spoke German to them, and they didn't want to speak German. And they were little, and I couldn't be angry with them, but I was so sad, she said. It was so horrible. And at this moment, when she's telling me something that happened like 30 years before, because she had grown children now. She's still deeply sad because of that. So parents apparently feel also, they feel this rejection at the same time they feel, oh, you know, a 4-year-old, they're not doing this on purpose. But I'd already had this experience though with rejection, but I didn't really think about it much when I was doing my PhD, and I was, because it also works the other way. It's not always the English that wins out. I was recording also a child in Bruges in the Netherlands who was hearing Dutch from her mother and pretty much everybody else except her father, who was an American and spoke English to her. And he wasn't home very much, so he didn't spend that much time with the child, but she was 3, and when he was home in the weekends, he told me, and I had recordings of that, I knew it was true, that she only said yes and no at age 3 in English, but she spoke Dutch very well. And he said to me, oh well, you know, she rejects me. You know, it's typical Freud. She's rejecting me because she doesn't want to speak my language. But that was his feeling. So he was starting to get angry at his child for not speaking his language. I also, at that time, I said, well, maybe if you talked more to her. And then he said, he quoted Chomsky to me and he said, no, input doesn't matter. So, because he had done translation studies in the United States, and well, he knew that that was not important. But you know, his feeling was definitely negative because his child wasn't speaking his language. Yes. So he felt also rejected, and that's not a good basis for having a parent-child relationship when you feel as a parent that your child is rejecting you from a very young age. And as adolescents, as I mentioned before, children who do not speak their parents' language, the children often feel very emotionally distant from their parents. So often teachers even advise parents to stop speaking the language that is not the school language. We don't have surveys we don't have statistics on this, but we know it happens. But it does not help in learning the school language. That's somehow what people think. And it is morally unacceptable because it goes against also the United Nations Convention for Child Rights, which was ratified by most countries in the early 1990s, and this is the article that is relevant here, Article 29 in Division 1 under Division C. So the education of the child shall be directed to the development of respect for the child's parents, his or her own cultural identity, language, and values, and for the national values of the country in which the child is living, yes, the country from which he or she may originate, and for civilizations different from his or her own. So this is all being negated, and unfortunately in Flanders, there are many, many schools that really prohibit children from using any other language than Dutch at school. In the classroom, outside the classroom, there are children whose mouth is being taped over because they dared speak Turkish to a friend, for instance. Yes. So I wrote I was asked actually to write a little by a journal in Belgium, a Dutch-speaking journal on education and the law, about this issue. So I hope somebody reads it. Yeah, because it's against the United Nations Convention for Child Rights. Okay, so don't do it. And it doesn't help. It does not help. It creates an aversion in many cases also towards the school language, towards this person who's taping up my mouth, right? And on the other hand, several studies show that a higher level of proficiency in emergent bilingual children's first language, so those are the children who have just one language at home and then get their second language through preschool, that these higher levels, so the better that a child speaks the home language, that correlates with their developing proficiency in the second language, especially Adam Winsler, here not far from here at George Mason University, has shown that. He's not the only one, but. And we know from several studies that well-developed proficiency in 2 languages strengthens and supports the well-being and integration of children who are growing up bilingually. So let's help children in their bilingual path. I think that's important, by informing parents about the best ways to interact in different languages at home and furnish them with research-based advice if they so wish, and that's one of the aims of HaBilNet, the Harmonious Bilingualism Network, and I hope that by the time Gert comes that finally the website will be up. It's a work in progress that will continuously be in progress. But we really want to do outreach that is really supported by research. There are a lot of websites which are run by individual parents who have their own experience and their experience is valid. But what's not valid is that they then claim that whatever it is that they've done as an individual family, that should be done by everybody. That's not always how it should be. And they may ignore a lot of the research or just don't know anything about it. So I'm hoping that here, this is not the only initiative, there are other initiatives as well, of course, but that we can contribute something. And what's also important is we should all, in preschools, at schools, actively value. It's not enough to just recognize, but to actively value all the languages that children bring from home to school. And this not so good, yeah, this better. Thank you.